I'm excited to be joined by today's speakers, Daniel Corsten, Tom Gruen, and Heather Kaplan. Daniel is a professor in the Department of Technology and Operations at IE Business School. He has worked with dozens of consumer products companies, helping them to navigate the new online and omni-channel retail reality. Tom is a professor of marketing at the University of New Hampshire. His research focuses on the management of customer relationships, including retail out-of-stocks, category management, sales, marketing, outsourcing, and value creation. Heather Kaplan is the Customer Success Director in the Americas for Clavis Insight. She and her team help product manufacturers maximize the business value they get from the Clavis Insight e-commerce insights and analytics. Now, my pleasure to hand the speaking over to Daniel Corsten. Daniel?
Thank you, Paul. Now you see it, now you don't. We're happy and honored to present the first phase of a global research study that Tom and myself conducted, and we reached the end of phase number 1, and we can share some of the results already. And already now I can allude to the fact that there is going to be a phase number 2, and if some of you who are listening and joining in are interested in pursuing with us the second phase, just let us know. It's about online availability to purchase in non-food categories, and this is done by our universities in collaboration with the availabilitylab.com. Paul, next slide, please. The agenda of today's short webinar is motivation, overview, and method of the study. We will define and describe online availability to purchase, discuss the extent of online non-availability and its causes. We are going to show how online shoppers experience the lack of availability, explain shopper switching behaviors as far as our research shows, examine the effects of the switching on retailers and brands, and show how an analytics program to monitor online channel availability can be created. Next slide. In 2002, we embarked on our journey about retail out-of-stocks. At the time, in 2000 and 2002, there was very little talk about online availability. As a matter of fact, most of the activities were still in the store, although we should be aware of the fact that at this time, Amazon was already on the world, but the importance of online wasn't very big. So we started out by looking at retail out-of-stocks. But then the next point on the slide would show that we realized later that the world had changed. As we all know, we're now in the digital economy. So the question was obvious: how would online availability be different from offline availability? So with this question on our mind, we wondered, how common are out-of-stocks online? How do shoppers react to online out-of-stocks? How does the shopper behavior impact brands and retailers? And what is the impact on sales? So we researched a total of 13,000 online shoppers at the major retailer websites over 273 days in 6 countries. Next slide. The 6 countries that we looked at are Germany, the UK, France, Japan, China, and the United States. Next slide. And the 6 categories that we researched, you see here. They go from baby care to fabric care, oral care, shave care, skin care, to hair care. And as it is clear, and as I would like to point out, this is an industry-sponsored research study, and we're obviously very pleased and very grateful to the sponsor of the study to have allowed us to do this research. Next slide. We conducted, as you see, a multi-country, multi-category study. And so we had to divide our study into multiple parts. Study 1 was worked with Clavis Insights, who helped us extract category level for 273 days, the first 3 quarters of the year 2016, which gave us 12 million data points to analyze. Study number 2 was conducted with the help of a US data provider. We collected, to enhance the data set we had from Clavis, data from panelists who purchased the target category online. We had a total of 8,185 qualified responses in the US. In the other countries, we used a global data provider who conducted research in the UK, Germany, France, Japan, and China. Again, data was collected in 2016 from September to October, and we had around 1,000 qualified responses per country for a little more than 5,000. These 3 studies were complemented with a 4th study where we then went into depth with interviews and workshops with leading brands and retailers. Next slide. Now, in the offline world, measuring availability was easy. You would go into a store, stand in front of a shelf, and if you knew there should be 100 different products on the shelf, you'd simply count the holes as they were identified by price tags and a glaring gap, and you would know what is the out of stock and what is the availability. In the online world, it is just a little more complicated. We define an item, an SKU, to be available to purchase at a retailer if it is shown to be in stock at the retailer. In other words, the retailer purchased the product, shows it as in stock. If it can be purchased on the retailer's marketplace, I assume you are aware of the way that most retailers' marketplaces work, and there are obviously fewer retailers with marketplaces than retailers with in-stock availability. So this is an important, yet not widespread phenomenon, or even less widespread. An item is available at a retailer if it can be purchased at the retailer's physical store. In other words, if, for instance, at Walmart.com, Walmart says it is not available online, but Walmart.com directs you to a store near you after you've entered your zip code and suggests that the product is available there. In these 3 cases, we consider a product to be available because it can be purchased more or less within physical and digital reach. However, an item is considered to be not available if it is shown to be out of stock on the product page. And this is when the product page indicates clearly that the product is unavailable by saying it's out of stock, it's not available, or something that indicates on the product page that the product is currently not available for purchase. And what makes the online world very different from the offline world, if a product is void. Void is something, a word that we took from our industry sponsor, a word that you've already heard in other circumstances, which is the case when a product page has been suppressed. In other words, we don't know whether the product is available or not, but the product page is inaccessible. And that is a digital equivalent to unavailable, but not because it is indicated to be out of stock, but because you cannot even enter the product page, which can have very different reasons. We'll talk about that later. Next slide. Now, you're all waiting for the big numbers. So let's take a look at the extent and the causes of missing available to purchase products. Next slide. Some of you might remember that for many years, and perhaps still now, the extent to which products are out of stock offline hovers around 8.3%. Now, when we did our research, we actually found that 19.9% of products are not available to purchase. In other words, available to purchase online across the 6 countries, across the many retailers, and across the categories that we looked at, hovers at around 80%. Now, this number is obviously disturbing, to say the least. And the question is, why is the online rate so high? Now, if we just click a little further, you will see the problem is that in the online world, we have 2 different types of not available situations. As I mentioned before, we have the out of stock, which is at 8.1%. This is, let me repeat this, when the website says the product's not available. Remember, that the offline equivalent to that was 8.3%. So looking at the striking similarities between the numbers, we see that, contrary to many intuitions, the situation online is not better than it is offline. Now, obviously, differences exist between categories and countries, but the average is the average. On the other side, we have 11.8% void products, which is new, which means that the product page is not accessible for commercial or technical reasons. And this is perhaps something to be considered because it also crosses functions and needs a specific way to be addressed. Voids add to out of stocks. Next slide, please. How does the situation look like across the world? Now, averages are averages, so it's worth digging a little deeper, and we see clear differences. We can say countries like Germany, the UK, and perhaps the UK are similar in their maturity regarding online availability. We have availability levels of around 80, 75, 78%, or in other words, online out of stocks are between 4 and 5%. The voids are between 10 and 12%. Marketplaces are around 9 or 8%. These three countries seem to be following different patterns. Two countries that have very different patterns on the other side are China and France. France seems to have very low out of stocks, but they do have extraordinarily high voids. Our research suggests that in France, a lot of the out of stocks are actually not shown as out of stocks, but the product pages are voided. Therefore, we have this slightly different picture. But perhaps you already looked at that. China is definitely striking. We see 18.7% out of stocks online. This is the biggest number and clearly skews our average towards the lower end of availability. Next slide, please. So, by now you should be asking yourself, what are the causes? Why on earth is availability so low? We are starting to understand this better through the first workshops, and obviously we're interested and delighted in working with you on this. But clearly, if we assume out of stocks and voids are two different categories, then product supply, ruptures in product supply, under capacity leads to problems in product supply that can cause out of stocks, and demand management is clearly a problem. I just have to say two words: Singles Day, Black Friday. All of these problems exacerbate the problems regarding forecasting that traditionally in the CPG industry, forecast errors hover around 40%. So this is clearly a cause of concern. On the void side, on the online world, we have product transition that happen very quickly. And if a product transition isn't smooth because products are missing, data is missing, content is missing, digital assets are missing, these product transitions do not happen smoothly and the retailer may decide to void the product. Alternatively, master data and content are issues that already haunt retailers and brands offline, and online are adding even more to the problem because we have so many SKUs that go in and out and that need to be managed through systems that are not necessarily made for that. Next slide. So, how do shoppers respond to this? Now, this is Tom's part. I'll hand over to Tom.
Thank you, Daniel. And what we are looking at is basically three aspects when shoppers experience non-availability to purchase. The first thing we want to look at is how do they experience that? The second we want to look at is how many. And the third is how do they react, and that is switch. And the first thing is that as we looked at this, and this is our shopper data, the shoppers told us that 45% of the time when they experienced a non-availability purchase, it was that they actually found that it was stated that it was out of stock. The second group of 27% stated that it was stated on the website that it was out of stock, but there would be a significant, not stated out of stock, but there would be a significant delay in receiving that. So it might be 1 or 2 weeks, which indicates that the item is back ordered. That is, that it is not in stock. Only 20% of the time did they say that the item was not displayed, and then 5% they were told that the item was only available to purchase at the store, that it was not available to purchase online. Let's go to the next slide. And so the question that we ask is, of course, how often was this done? And overall, we found that it was about 16% of the time shoppers experience a non-ATP, which we found very interesting because this corresponded somewhat closely to the numbers that we were able to ascertain through our data with the by looking through the Clavis data of actual non-availability online. The thing that we also then found as we drilled down into this, we found two very striking findings. And the first is that the experience of the extent of availability is much higher for younger shoppers than for older shoppers. Almost 21% for those in our youngest age group, only 11.3% for those in our oldest age group. Really no difference between male and female, but a significant difference in between white shoppers and all other ethnicities and races. So again, these are issues that became very clear and should be addressed at some point in examining your examining availability. So the next slide. So the question we have to ask then is, how do shoppers respond to non-availability to purchase? And basically, shoppers have 5 responses. They can first substitute a brand variant. They could substitute a different brand. And those first 2 are staying at the same online store. They could switch their online store, going from one store to a different one online, which should seem very easy to do. They could switch their channel to a physical store. Or their 5th option is that they could switch their intention as they do not make a purchase. They intended to make a purchase, but now they don't. They either delay or cancel, somehow postpone. So those are the 5 different responses that someone can have. And so in general, what we find is that, of course, retailers are very interested if you are going to switch your online store or even switch your channel to a physical store, or switch your intention and don't make your purchase. And of course, brand managers are very interested if there's going to be a substitution of a different brand. So let's go to the next slide. And what we find here is very interesting. I think if we click once more, if you go to the right, you can see that globally, switching changes from 22% switch their online store, 27% and 29%, so almost 55 to 60% either switch within the store, 10% switch channel, and 12% switch their intention. What we found interesting was that there's significant variance of this between countries. So for example, in the United States, we see that only 15% of the shoppers in the US will actually switch their store. And we account that to be for the very large presence and strong presence of Amazon. If we click once more, we'll see that in China, however, 34% of those experiencing non-availability with switch store. And again, we look at the retail structure in China where there are 3 or 4 dominant players, and there are much more opportunities to switch stores. Click once more. We'll see there's very much similarity between the 3 European countries, and that they are all willing to, much more willing to switch brands than in the other countries. So we can see some fairly dominant effects, or some very large effects based on the different countries. Let's go to the next slide. And the question we then ask is that, how does online shopper switching differ from brick and mortar retail? And again, comparing USA only, we saw in the previous slide that only 15% of online shoppers would switch stores, whereas we found that in traditional brick and mortar retailing, almost 30%, or a little over 30% would switch stores. Alternatively, switching to different brands or brand variants within the same store is much more common online than in traditional stores. And of course, the switching channel is new because before we weren't able to switch channels, and now, of course, and then on the farthest to the right, our online retail, we we were delaying only about 16% of the time, whereas in traditional retail, we would be much more willing to switch or to postpone. And so again, all of these things show that there are really vast differences between the online shopper and the retail brick-and-mortar shopper. The online shopper we're seeing to be much less patient and much more goal-oriented, perhaps, than the traditional shopper. So let's go on to the next slide. And we looked then and say, what other factors affect switching behavior besides the country? And of course, we found that there were some definite category effects across our 6 categories. We found some big effects, and those seem to be quite, they seem to follow the concentration of the market share of those categories. We also looked at how was the non-availability to purchase countered? Was it that there was set out of stock? Was it a delay? Was it not found? And we didn't find as much difference in there as we expected. There was some. We also looked at when in the shopping trip did the non-availability occur? Was it early or late, or somewhere in the middle? And what we found is that where it was early in the shopping trip, shoppers were much more interested in switching brands at the same store, either switching brands or brand variants. And late, if it was late in the trip, they would be much more open to actually going to a different store. We looked at the online, or we looked at the situation effect, and that was the degree to which shoppers felt they had different opportunity costs of having the item right now, or different substitution costs of not getting the specific item. We looked also at the online shopper type, and we found that there were 3 distinct categories of shoppers. One is what we call the hardcore online shopper, and they're very characteristic of being very impatient, switching online, being very goal-oriented, getting the job done. We found another one, which was a true what we call omni-channel shopper. They would be much more open to switch stores, switch channels. They were much more interested in perhaps probing around a little bit to get what they wanted. And then a third category of shoppers, which seemed like they were really somewhat reluctant shoppers, that they didn't seem to particularly enjoy online shopping or offline shopping, but they tended to act in their switching behaviors very similar to the multi-channel shoppers. And finally, we looked at demographic effects, and unlike the strong effects that we found for age and ethnicity and the extent, we didn't find really large factors in demographics. So let's go to the next slide. And so at this point here, I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Daniel Corsten, who's going to talk about how this all affects sales.
Thank you, Tom. Now, the numbers already out there: extent of online availability 80%, extent of non-availability 20%, big numbers. We see that shoppers switch differently. Sometimes they switch online store, sometimes they switch brands. So how does this affect it? Tom already alluded to the fact that retailers lose sale when shoppers switch online store, when they switch to another offline store, and if they have the intention to switch by delaying or canceling. This is not good for the retailer. But brands lose sales when shoppers switch brand, obviously, but also when they switch potentially by delaying or canceling the purchase. And the shoppers always lose. We do not know right now, but we know that from the offline world and from some experiments that there is a very dramatic long-term store and brand equity effect, because shoppers seek convenience online, and lack of availability is the opposite of convenience. So what does it all amount to? Next slide, please. It all amounts to shopper transaction loss. We are careful, one slide back, please. We are careful not to call it lost sales, because our methodology doesn't really let us quantify the exact lost sales. For this, we would have to know what is the demand on a day in order to find out. We would have to find out, is it a slow mover, a fast mover? We do not necessarily have this at our fingertips. And that's why, by the way, I can already tell that retailers might have slightly different results, perhaps because they have access to more fine-grained data. But for brands, this information is brand new. To have this information at their fingertips helps brands to make better decisions and to get a sense of the shopper transaction loss. Just to put this into perspective, if indeed the availability is only 80%, and as you know, we measure one observation as one SKU not available, void or out of stock per days, that means that the products that are not available and void are not available for sales 20% of the days. In other words, if you have, as an example, online sales of 100 million, you actually made those 100 million in sales not in 360 days, but in 300 days. In other words, your lost sales is what you could have sold in those 2 additional months per year. And you can easily calculate for yourself how much that is. We are currently working on models that allow us to quantify this even better by including other variables like demand, supply, and many other variables so that we can calculate for you a much more detailed view on these kind of things. Next slide. And this is what we want to do in the next phase. We are looking for partners who would like to extend the study from non-food to food categories and also run additional studies, experiments. And in return, you will receive category-specific insights on the extent, the reactions, the loss, which we haven't shown, and the root causes, of course. And we will be happy to work with you. And please, we are starting a new wave of research very soon. So please contact us if you're interested and so that we can discuss the details around this. By the way, the results of the study will be available in more detail in 2018. So bear with us. With this, I want to hand over to Heather, who will talk a little bit more about how to create an analytics program to monitor online channel availability. Heather, please.
Great, thank you. So previously in brick-and-mortar world, manufacturers had what we call a push strategy. And that meant that they worked to bring their product to a retailer, as much product as they forecasted demand to be. And they would work with that retailer to have displays or other promotions to get consumers excited about the product. If consumers really like the product, it could result in out of stocks as they bought more than was forecasted. Now what we see online is more of a pull strategy, which is a bit different, where manufacturers can get consumers excited about a product and build that demand, and from there determine how much product they need. But they still do need to work closely to understand what demand is and make sure that they don't have out of stock issues. As you've heard so far, out of stocks are something that we really try to minimize. They result in lost sales, of course, but they really test consumer loyalty. And I think we went over some really great examples about how consumers might shift to a different brand or a different retailer or not make a purchase altogether. But they're going to get frustrated if they can't find their product on shelf. And so it's something that we really want to minimize. Now, when we think about the e-commerce world, not having a product available is really going to have a negative impact on search. To show you what I mean there, I took a look at a product over a 3-week time frame, and I looked at where it was ranking in search results as I searched for its category. So you can see in the beginning of the month of September, the product was ranking about 37 to 34th place in search results, which is pretty strong. As soon as the product went out of stock on September 4th, you can see that the search rankings declined significantly down to 76. And it took a while for the search rankings to go back up to the previous levels. There were some days where there were marketplace or locked buy box issues. And even in, say, the 9th to the 14th, when the product was in stock, it did take some time for it to really get back to a higher search ranking result. Now, on September 18th, when the product had been marketplace for 4 days, the search ranking declined and then continued to decline from there. So this is definitely a big problem and something that we want to try to avoid, as where you're ranking in search results is so crucial to your overall sales as a brand. We took a look at one category in particular and analyzed the top 50 selling SKUs, taking a look at correlation to determine what metrics really affect overall sales. And search ranking had the biggest effect on sales. An item going from position number 5 down to 15 resulted in a 40% sales loss. So having a higher search ranking is crucial, and then keeping it high is so important to having those strong sales. Now, availability alone resulted in sales loss, about 10% per item per day of out of stock. And between search and availability, those had such a huge effect on sales, more than other things like promotion, image accuracy, reviews, etc. And that's something that is within your control and that you can work to manage pretty closely. Now, what's interesting about the e-commerce world is that there are so many different ways to shop online, and it seems to be growing and evolving and changing so much, even every couple of months. What we've noticed is becoming increasingly popular is the click and collect model, where you can order online and then go to a grocery store to pick up the product. This is especially popular in higher populated cities like Chicago, LA, San Francisco, etc. And what's interesting here is that availability and distribution is going to be different by individual store location. Now, another way of shopping is home delivery, and this is becoming popular outside of those major cities, where there are a couple of fulfillment centers across the US, and consumers can shop in one of those fulfillment centers online to have products shipped to their door. The availability and distribution is going to depend on where they're located and what distribution center is close to them. So overall, thinking about availability, there's a lot of things that you want to consider. One, think about how availability is different across retailers. As was discussed earlier in the presentation, thinking about what an out of stock looks like. If a product is void and simply not available if you are searching for it online, or if you can find a product but you see that it's out of stock, that can lead to frustration. And understanding how this differs across retailers, especially those that are offering click and collect or home delivery or other ways of interacting with your product. Make sure that you're really tracking this closely and specifically going down to zip codes and individual stores to make sure that you can react really fast. Again, knowing that the longer your product is out of stock, the bigger impact it's going to have on your search ranking and your sales. One thing that you can do is you can set up alerts on our platform so that you're notified of any out of stock issues, and that'll help you to be much more proactive. Paul?
Great, thank you everyone for your wonderful insights. We've now reached the question and answer portion of the program. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we are all on mute, so if you do have any questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box located on the right-hand side of your screen. And while you're entering in your questions, Heather's just going to give a brief overview of the Clavis platform and specifically how it can help you measure your online channel availability. Heather, back to you.
Sure, thanks, Paul. So here at Clavis, we've built a framework which we call the 6 Ps. And this talks about ways that you can move sales by impacting, for example, the price of your product, or the promotions that you have, or the placement of your item online. These 5 Ps are within your control: product, placement, price, promotion, and page. And those are all going to have an effect on the 6th P, which is performance. And that includes your search ranking results, your sales, and your share. There are a lot of different ways that we can analyze these 6 Ps using the Clavis product, but I'm going to focus specifically on the product dimension. We can analyze portfolio and availability, understanding which items are available and if they're in stock or out of stock. And we can set up alerts within our tool so that on a daily basis, if a product is out of stock, you're sent an email notification, and that allows you to be very proactive and manage it very quickly. And to get really granular, we can look at our location-based analytics tool. That looks at click and collect and home delivery, which we recently talked about. We can go down to an individual store level or down to a market or a zip code to understand differences in distribution and availability. And to show you an example of what this looks like, we can analyze all of the SKUs within your portfolio by store, by zip code, and understand their distribution, availability, price, and promotion. This can be refreshed either daily or weekly, and it'll help you manage your availability and any out of stocks.
Great, thank you, Heather. Perfect. So we're now officially into the Q&A portion of the program. And actually, Heather, the first question is for you. So if we're thinking about going to a location-based analytics program, should we monitor all of our stores, or should we only think of a select few? How should we be thinking about that?
Great question. Typically, I like to start with a crawl, walk, run approach. So rather than trying to analyze every single store within a retailer or every single zip code, start with a couple of the key stores or maybe key markets that you can directly influence and quickly. Once you have a system in place to work through those zip codes or those markets, then you can start rolling this out to a much more broader universe.
Great, thanks. And I think the next question is for Daniel and Tom concerning the slide about availability and kind of differences by race. And the basic question was, could there be differences in the platforms available from each country that could potentially be creating some of these out-of-stock issues?
Tom?
Good. Am I on now?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Tom.
Sorry, you're on.
I don't know the answer to the second part of that question, of the difference in the platforms that could be creating that. It's the area that we've looked at in terms of trying to explore the differences in race and ethnicity, and the extent that they've been experienced, that's been experienced, that difference. We've tried to probe that to say, is that a product mix? Is it a variety issue? Well, we honestly don't really know. We found that, and it's been something we've been wanting to probe in more detail. But it's just that it stood out so clearly to us. We just wanted to mention that because it was very clear. So we obviously will be looking for ideas and perhaps some other hypotheses. We're testing some, but we don't have the conclusions yet.
Great. Well, it looks like you guys did a great job of answering everybody's questions. Those are actually the only two that we had for this afternoon. So just a couple of quick announcements before we do leave. All individuals will receive a copy of the recording and slide deck, and that should be available within the next 2 days. And we'd also like to ask you to take just a few seconds to answer our post-webinar survey, which will pop up on your screen as soon as you log off. Certainly let us know what you think about the content. And if you'd like more information on Clavis Insight or that GMA study, you could indicate that by checking the check boxes in that survey. Thank you again, Daniel, Tom, and Heather, for your wonderful insights, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.